Let me invite you to be opening your Bibles to Galatians chapter 6, please. Galatians chapter 6. Servant of God, well done. Thy glorious warfare's past. The battle's fought, the race is won, and thou art crowned at last. I don't know if you've ever heard that poem before. I have used it on a number of occasions in doing funerals for faithful Christians as they completed their earthly journey. And as I pondered and reflected on that poem, I thought about this. Do you relish such a sentiment to be said of you? Servant of God, well done. What a thought. Now, obviously, the only one whose pronouncement of those words truly and eternally matter is Christ's at the judgment. I'm inclined to think, Brother Gant, that the poet there had in mind Matthew chapter 25. It would appear to me at least that phrase, servant of God, well done, he derived from Jesus' parable of the talents that is recorded for us there in Matthew 25, beginning in verse 14. The parable itself, as well as the context in which it is found, both seem to suggest that Jesus taught this parable to direct his disciples' thoughts to that final judgment day, as well as help them understand the divine standard that will be used for that unparalleled day of reckoning. Now, I think we're probably pretty familiar with that parable of the talents. And if so, you might remember the Lord's assessment in the parable, the Lord's assessment of the servant to whom he had given 5 talents. You remember he went out and prudently used those 5 talents to gain 5 more. And so on the day of reckoning, when the Lord returned back and he came, he had 10 to give to him. The same was true of the one to whom he had given 2 talents. You might remember, he similarly went out and was able to double that. And so on the day of accounting, he came and gave his Lord 4. But you remember the pronouncement that the Lord made of both of those servants. His servant said unto them, well done, thou good and faithful servant. Thou hast been faithful over a few things. I will make thee ruler over many things. Enter thou into the joy of thy Lord. And so again, I would ask us, do we not thrill at the thought of hearing those words from Jesus as our divine judge on that future judgment day? Well done. Well done, thou good and faithful servant. Now, I don't want to answer for you, but I'm inclined to believe that all of us, again, would delight in having that pronounced to us on the final day of accounting. And if so, well, then the counsel that is recorded for us here in Galatians chapter 6, particularly verses 9 and 10, that inspired counsel should garner our utmost attention. That warrants our earnest consideration, and here's why. Because in it, the Apostle Paul provides inspired, pertinent, practical advice concerning well-doing. We do see the connection, right? If we eventually anticipate hearing those welcomed words by Jesus, well done, then on the day of accounting, you know what that necessitates? That then means that now, while I'm living here on earth, now I need to be found consistently well-doing so that one day he can say, well done. Let's read the verses together. Galatians chapter 6, beginning in verse 9. Paul, again, by the guidance of the Holy Spirit, says, "And let us not be weary in well-doing, for in due season we shall reap if we faint not. As we have therefore opportunity, let us do good unto all, especially unto them who are of the household of faith." Now, brethren, all Christians, every Christian ought to major in well-doing. For whatever period of time that God privileges us to grace this earth, we ought to be majoring in well-doing with the joyful anticipation of hearing Jesus say in the last day, "Well done, well done." And that's why I submit for your consideration these two verses. If that is our hope, these two verses should be of the greatest import to every Christian. And so, that's what I invite us to do. I invite you to join with me in a careful analysis of this inspired counsel regarding well-doing. Because again, if we want to hear "well done" in the judgment, it will only be because during our earthly stay, we have been consistently well-doing. And so once we hear this counsel, I pray that each of us will resolve to consistently apply it to our individual lives. So, let me invite your attention again to the verses. We're going to begin with really just the first section of verse 9 this morning, because we want to focus our attention on what the inspired apostle tells us we should not do regarding well-doing. Notice how Paul begins this inspired counsel. He begins by urging Christians not to do something as it pertains to well-doing. Again, verse 9 beginning, "And let us not be weary in well-doing." Are you surprised that Paul begins with a negative? I mean, does that in any way intrigue you? Ricky, we don't kind of like negative stuff, do we? You know, to hear negative things. We were talking about the pessimist this morning, you know, always viewing the negative. And yet here, the Apostle Paul begins with a negative. Certainly don't know why. It might speak to the fact that we human beings, we need the "thou shalt nots." Even though we might not like them, it might speak to the fact that we need them. That might attest to the fact that God, as our Creator, who knows us far better than we know ourselves, it might speak to the fact as to why God, knowing this about His crown creation, that we need the "thou shalt nots," when He gives a law to His covenant people, the nation of Israel under the Old Testament, and He gives them those first 10 commandments, there were a lot of "thou shalt nots," weren't there? In fact, of the 10, 8 of them, 8 of the 10, contained a "thou shalt not." Might speak to the fact that we need them, don't we? And that also might be at least suggested by how often you hear people say, "Well, does the Bible say we can't? Does God say we can't do it?" You know, we might ask be found asking those questions. We hear other people ask that. Well, maybe God knows that about us, and so He does regularly give us those "thou shalt nots." Possibly that's the reason that here Paul, writing under the direction of God, His Holy Spirit, who recognizes that tendency on the part of man that we need the "thou shalt nots," maybe that's why he begins by issuing a negative with regards to what Christians should not do concerning well-doing. Now, Whether or not that factored into it, I have no way of knowing. But here's something else that might have factored into it. You know, typically, would you not agree it is the case that a person issues a thou shalt not because there is some concern that a certain behavior or attitude is already occurring? Or they think it is likely to occur? Let me offer a scenario that we might be able to appreciate that might illustrate that. Think about a family, all right? And dad's about ready to go off to work in the morning, and so, you know, he's heading out the door, and if the children are little enough, they're running up, you know, I love you, Daddy, goodbye, have a good day, all this stuff. And can you appreciate the dad saying, all right, kids, don't give your mom a hard time today while I'm away? Can you relate to that, any of you? Now, probably Dad said that either because they had already started giving Mom a hard time, maybe at breakfast or whatever, or he thinks more than likely they'll start giving her a hard time. Maybe that factors in to why Paul is urging the Galatian saints not to be weary in well-doing, either because he had some knowledge that those Christians were already beginning to do that, or maybe he feared they possibly would commence to do that in the very near future. You know, as we think about the circumstances surrounding those brethren at Galatia, it's not hard to fathom. You remember, Paul has to deal with false teachers. False teachers that entered in among the ranks of God's people there in the region of Galatia. And you remember they were promoting erroneous teachings pertaining to the Christian's the Christian's relationship to the law. And please appreciate that was causing real problems. In fact, so much so that Paul relates to the brethren there at Galatia that even the Apostle Peter had been caught up in that. And so there in Galatians chapter 2, he talks about how that when he was at Antioch and Peter came there, that Peter had even hypocritically now withdrew himself from the Gentile Christians and were only fellowshipping with the Jews. And so here's the Apostle Peter, who was even struggling with this matter. And then Paul goes on to explain that this in turn contributed to the dissembling of other faithful, established Christians, even like Barnabas. See, this could have been a real problem. And that problem there in Galatia may have been contributing to the Christians there growing weary. Not only that, but if you still have your Bibles open there to Galatians chapter 6, back up one chapter. And look at some of the things that he's saying in chapter 5 about, again, what seems to have at least be some tendencies or the possibility of occurring there in the churches of Galatia. Look at verse 15, chapter 5, verse 15. But if you bite and devour one another, take heed that you be not consumed one of another. Does it sound like some tension, some turmoil, some friction is going on maybe among the members? And then notice what he says in verse 16. This I say then, walk in the Spirit, and you shall not fulfill the lust of the flesh. For the flesh lusts against the Spirit, and the Spirit against the flesh. And these are contrary the one to the other, so that you cannot do the things that ye would. And so he's talking about this constant battle that goes on between the flesh and the Spirit. Maybe and then reason why there might have been some weariness emerging among the Christians. Look at what he says at the end of the chapter. Let us not be desirous of vainglory, provoking one another, envying one another. All I'm suggesting, brethren, is the fact that Paul would begin with this negative in issuing counsel with regards to well-doing what not to do might be suggestive that it had already begun. Or at least they might have been on the verge of doing what he urges them not to do. All right, so having kind of set out why he starts here, we do need to pause here in our study and really carefully give consideration to this matter of well-doing. Because again, that is what is central to Paul's inspired counsel here in these verses. And again, that should be very important to us, to every Christian. If we look forward ultimately to hear, well done, brethren, this matter of well-doing should be something that is of the utmost importance to us. We want to be well informed about well-doing so that one day we can hear, well done. So let's look at the words. Let's look at the phrase used here by Paul, well-doing. In the original, it is two Greek words denoting good and to do good. All right? Now, sometimes in the New Testament, it's interesting to me, those two words are brought together to make one word, a compound word. And in places that that's the case, typically it is translated the same, well-doing. But it is good and to do good. And we don't have to know anything about Greek to understand that's what Paul is talking about, because when you drop down to verse 10, where we will eventually see Paul telling us what we should do, notice what he says, as you have therefore opportunity, let us do what? Do good. Do good. And so he's urging them to do good. That is, don't grow weary in well-doing. Well, what does that mean? Well, Vine says it conveys the idea of, quote, to do well, to do excellently, to act honorably. Another commentator offers this insight, quote, it is doing what is morally good and persistently noble. Still another commentator, he says it includes that which is beneficent or kindly. And so, friends, hearing all those definitions and all those connotations of what these two words mean, well-doing, it speaks to doing good both in quantity or quality and effect. Quality and effect. I like what one writer said. He says, quote, it is doing that which is beautiful. That's a good way of looking at it. Doing that which is beautiful. And finally, let me share with you what Brother Lipscomb said in his commentary on this verse. He succinctly put it, quote, well-doing is to do the will of God. End of quote. That's pretty simple, isn't it? Well-doing is to do the will of God. And when you think about the will of God, well, it takes in all those other things that we just talked about. It is to do that which is well, what is excellent, what is honorable. It is to do that which is morally good, persistently noble. It is to do that which is beneficent and kindly. It is to do that which is beautiful. Because God's will is all of those things. And so I think Brother Lipscomb really has put his finger on the pulse here. Well-doing is to do the will of God. It is to do that which is spiritually beneficial, to do that which is spiritually profitable, to do that which is beautiful. But when you hear that, well-doing is to do the will of God, it's very concise, but it's very broad, isn't it? I mean, that takes in a lot of things. That's a very comprehensive concept. Because as we know, the will of God has been preserved for us in this book. And that's pretty large book. It contains a lot as it relates to the will of God. But that's what we need to be doing. Now, let's kind of narrow it down. Let's look at it in the context in which Paul offers this counsel. Because here, immediately in the context of Galatians chapter 6, at least it would seem to refer to what he just spoke of in the previous verses. And beginning in verse 6, Paul was talking about Christians providing financial support to those who were teaching and preaching the gospel. Look at what he says immediately before. Look at verse 6. Let him that is taught in the word communicate unto him that teacheth in all good things. Be not deceived. God is not mocked. For whatsoever a man sows, that shall he also reap. He that sows to the flesh shall of the flesh reap corruption, but he that soweth to the Spirit shall of the Spirit reap life everlasting. Immediately after that, let us not be weary in well-doing. But we could back it up even further. If you go all the way back to the beginning of Galatians chapter 6, you will find that Paul there was giving instructions with regards to the ideas of restoring the erring and bearing one another's burdens and being responsible to bear one's own burdens. Now, I'm sure in hearing those things, brethren, we all recognize all of these are God-ordained components of the will of God. They are all integral and vital elements of God's will for our lives. They're all part of well-doing. Here, at least in part, is the good work that God calls upon all Christians to be regularly participating in. So it could be that Paul is thinking about those things. And having enumerated some of these responsibilities that fall on all Christians, he says, don't grow weary. Don't be weary in faithfully, consistently, conscientiously fulfilling this part of the will of God. However, friends, I do not think we should limit it to that. It may be that's what Paul has in mind. It may be that that's why he issues this inspired counsel where he does in this letter. But please appreciate it comes at the end of the letter. He has said a lot prior to that. But friends, let's again take Brother Lipscomb's statement to heart. Well-doing is doing the will of God in its entirety. And so even though it comes here, Paul's having enumerated some specific responsibilities, specific areas of Christian living and duties, but friends, I don't think we should limit it just to those. In fact, I believe Paul clearly has in mind it's entailing all of the responsibilities that God enjoins upon His people. These are the things, this is the well-doing, the will of God that He would have His people consistently doing as they represent Him while we are here upon this earth. Christians should be always well-doing, always doing well, doing good. Because, brethren, that is at the heart of who we are. Remember, Christians are disciples of Jesus. Christians are, in essence, followers of Jesus. And we, like Him, need to be going about doing good. Remember, Sister Angie, we referenced this verse in our Bible study with regards to Peter's being in the house of Cornelius. You remember that? Peter's being in the house of Cornelius and those who are assembled with him, maybe family, neighbors, friends, whoever. And here he is presenting to them the gospel of Jesus Christ, and he introduces to them Jesus of Nazareth, who went about doing good. That's who we're following. And here is Peter summarizing his life. Jesus of Nazareth went about doing good. That was one of the reasons, Brother Gant, I asked you to lead before the sermon, all the way my Savior leads me. I mean, that's who we are as Christians. We're to be following the Savior's lead. He is to be directing us. We are to be trying to follow in His footsteps as we walk in this earthly sojourn. And you remember what it says there in the chorus about Jesus. Jesus doeth all things well. Brethren, that's who we are. We're His disciples. That's who we are following. And therefore, like Him, Christians need to be actively, constantly engaged in well-doing. Going about doing good. Doing the will of God. Is it any wonder then, in light of the fact that that's who we are and what we should be doing, is it any wonder then that Paul cautions Christians, don't be weary in that. Don't be weary. Now we're going to stay here in Galatians chapter 6, but I do want to at least provide this for your information because I found it interesting. That's not the only time Paul's going to say that. In fact, he's almost going to recite the same words over in 2 Thessalonians chapter 3 and verse 13. There we read, be ye brethren, be not weary in well-doing. Almost the exact same words. Don't grow weary in the work of well-doing. All right, well, we've talked about it being a negative. We talked about what well-being is, or well-doing is. Let's turn our attention now to this idea of growing weary. What does that mean? Paul, if I understand it, is not so much here addressing a person's behavior yet. Not their actions yet. Paul here is giving attention to the spirit, to the attitude, to the heart. And please notice he includes himself in this. Look again at chapter 6 and verse 9. Notice the pronoun. Let us not grow weary. He's including himself. He knows that's a possibility. And he is encouraging other Christians along with himself, don't grow weary. Now again, he's talking, particularly addressing the state of mind, the condition of the heart. Obviously, that then will impact our behavior, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. But he's saying you cannot permit weariness to become your state of heart, your condition of mind, when it pertains to this idea of well-doing. So what is he cautioning against? Weariness. Well, it really denotes the state of, according to Thayer, utterly spiritlessness. Utterly spiritless. Brother Vines, in his comment, in his literary work, he says it means lacking courage or losing heart, being faint-hearted, weary. You know, we sometimes use that term, and oftentimes we use it describing a condition of our physical bodies being tired. I'm weary. In fact, if you look the word up, weary in Webster's, that's the first definition he gives, the idea of exhausted in strength or endurance, the idea of being worn out. Have you ever experienced that? Physically, have you ever remember a time when you're engaged in some serious physical exertion that renders you so exhausted that you just cannot go on? I remember one time I was stationed at Langley, and a good Christian friend of mine, he was really into the gym and weightlifting and stuff like that. So he wanted to bring me on and join at the gym that he was going. So I went, and the trainer there said, "Okay, well, here's what we want you to do," and kind of give you an idea of what we have here. And we went through this this process of 45 minutes. And let me tell you, I didn't sign to go on because I was so exhausted. Literally, I was sitting there at the desk and the guy was asking me to sign and my hands were shaking. And I'm thinking, I'm not sure I can do this regularly. But that was my state. Physically, I was spent. I was so exhausted, I could barely raise my hand. That's what it means physically. Now, Paul is applying it to our spirits. And so Paul uses it to describe the state of tiredness, weariness, the idea of being spent in our spirit, in our heart. Brought about by what? Discouragement, disheartenment, disappointment, loss of heart. Now, going back to that physical analogy for me, all I needed to do, even at that point I could barely raise my hand, all I needed to do was get some rest. I needed to rehydrate. I needed to replenish, take in some calories, and you know what? I was fine. Now, again, I didn't sign up to be a member of the gym, but I was all right. So there is a period of rest. There is a period of replenishment that then allows you to go on. Now, my buddy, my brother in Christ who invited me, he didn't want me to quit. I quit. All right, I didn't go on. But that's not what we should do. Rest, replenishment, restore, then go back. See, I think Paul is recognizing that. There will come times when we kind of give out. But don't give in. Don't give up. Because see, that's the behavior. You remember I told you this isn't so much about behavior. We'll get that in the next verse. This isn't about the behavior yet. This is about the state of mind. This is about the condition of the heart. Weariness, discouragement, despair, loss of courage and faint-hearted. But why is that so dangerous? Because it could, as it did in my case, cause you to quit. That's why this is so dangerous. That's possibly why he started with this. Don't be weary. In my reading some things for this sermon, I came to appreciate very much the following observations that were made by somebody that I read. And maybe you can relate to it. It has to do with understanding why weariness might set in. But let me share it with you. Weariness, the writer goes on to say, is a state of mind and will that rather easily sets in. And then he goes on to quote, for 3 reasons, or under 3 conditions. He says, quote, when results are not always apparent at once, when those who should help refuse to cooperate, and when no reward seems ever to be coming our way. Now, I don't think the writer intended that to be an exhaustive list. But as I thought about it, weariness, I believe he is spot on. It often comes because results aren't always apparent at once. Those who we hope we could count on refuse to cooperate. And no reward seems to be coming anytime soon. Now, as I thought about that, then it's easy to make some illustrations that I think all of us can relate to. Think about a Christian wife who becomes mentally worn out, emotionally drained, wearied by dealing with an ungodly husband, who instead of trying to encourage her in leading her house in a godly way, he's always fighting against her. Can you understand how that can bring about weariness? We can flip the coin. What about a Christian husband who has grown weary? I mean, he's just given up, convinced that he can't stay with his rebellious wife, who is never submitting to him, who is never cooperating with him, who always seems to be, again, countering what he does and what he says. We can easily see it in the parent-child relationship. What about parents? They can become weary. They can emotionally just get, lose heart. Maybe it's rambunctious toddlers, and they'll see it again when you find rebellious teenagers. Preachers. Preachers can grow weary, even to the point of quit preaching. I can relate to that. Preachers can become weary maybe because no visible results are being observed. Maybe it's just growing weary from the weight of criticism that comes from those you're trying to spiritually lead. I just hope these illustrations can help us understand why Paul begins with urging us, don't grow weary. See, the fact is, this speaks to the reality that even in doing good, it's possible to get tired. It's possible to grow weary. And again, that can impact our behavior. That weariness can lead to quitting. Quitting what as Christians we know that what we should be doing. We ought to be well doing. We ought to be going about doing good. And if weariness sets in, it can lead to quitting. And so by enjoining Christians against weariness, Paul by implication is calling upon us to persevere. Persevere. You know, we in the past in sermon series, you remember endure to the finish. We have studied on the subject of perseverance. Persevere again means to, quote, continue in some effort, some course of action, etc., in spite of difficulty or opposition, to be steadfast in purpose and persist. So when Paul says, don't be weary, what he's saying is persevere. Despite the difficulties, despite the obstacles, despite the discouragement, despite the disappointments, don't lose heart to the point of quitting. You have to persevere. You have to persevere. And again, friends, the churches there in Galatia, they've had some failures. They've had some difficult circumstances. I mean, when you go back through the epistle, look at how he starts in Galatians chapter 1. In Galatians chapter 1 and verse 6, I marvel that you are so soon removed from him that called you into the grace of Christ unto another gospel. Look over in chapter 3 and verse 1. O foolish Galatians, who hath bewitched you that you should not obey the truth? Look at chapter 5 and verse 7. Chapter 5 and verse 7, Paul says, you did run well. Who then did hinder you that you should not obey the truth? Paul's urging them, despite every disappointment, despite all the discouragement, despite these failures that you have seen even in your own conduct, you must persevere in the practice of well-doing. You must continue to do good. Because if you allow weariness to set in, that will likely give way to quitting. So, brethren, we must conscientiously work at keeping our hearts and our spirits energized, alive, awake to our responsibility to serve God. And we have to do that with great persistence, with great perseverance. Why? Because even the best of us, even the Apostle Paul, knew it's possible to grow weary. Now again, this weariness might just mean I need to rest, I need to stop and replenish myself, but you cannot allow that to cause you to quit. But this is where it begins. It begins in the heart, begins in the condition of your state of mind. You can't grow weary. And so, we begin our study of well-doing. Oh, we had to do it with a negative, but that's where Paul began. Because he knew how challenging well-doing can be. He knew how that sometimes, despite your trying to do good, you're going to face discouragement and obstacles and difficulties and failures. You can lose heart. Don't grow weary. Here's what we cannot do as Christians. Grow weary. Or positively, persevere. Persevere. Lord willing, next week we will look at the close of verse 9, because that speaks to why. See, that speaks to motive. That speaks to an incentive as to why we should not do what Paul says we shouldn't do at the beginning of verse 9, and why we should do what he's going to go on to instruct us to do in verse 10. But for right now, I ask Brother Gant to lead us in, we'll work till Jesus comes. You know what that speaks to? Perseverance. That speaks to not growing weary. We're going to continue to work. We're going to continue to practice well-doing till Jesus comes, because when he comes, here's what we want to hear. Well done, thou good and faithful servant. And the only way we'll ever hear that is if we don't grow weary in well-doing.